Hello everyone, Jordan Boostmaster here, and what I have for you today is a very big, epic GoPro tutorial video. So what I'm gonna do is go through every single video option in these GoPros, and I'm gonna tell you exactly how they work so that you can get the best footage possible. I'm gonna tell you how to get the best HYPERSMOOTH performance, how to get more dynamic range, how to get the best colors. I'm sharing with you absolutely everything I know about how these cameras work. And yes, I do know a lot. I've been using these cameras since the Hero 2. I've even gone to school for filmmaking and everything. I totally understand how this all works. You might want to take notes as well. Some of it gets a little complicated. This tutorial is going to be for everyone. The amateurs who are new to how this stuff works, you're going to learn a lot from this. And even the professionals, I bet you're also going to learn a lot from this as well, because I've never seen the kind of stuff that I'm talking about in other videos. I'm really getting into the nitty-gritty of how certain options work and how they may affect other things as well. Since I've been working on this video for so long, I actually have a lot of information from the Hero 6, 7, 8, and 9 in this video. It's not just about the 9. So there is a wealth of information in this video, even with past cameras. But the thing is, a lot of those past cameras actually work very similarly to the 9 anyways. So a lot of the information is transferable anyways. I'll just give you a heads up. Some of the biggest and most in-depth sections in this video will be the HYPERSMOOTH section, the shutter speed, the EV comp, and the flat mode. And white balance is also interesting as well. Those are the most important sections on how to get the best quality footage if you don't want to watch the whole video. I'm going to put timestamps down in the description as well as chapters in the video so that you can easily navigate to each section that you want to watch. So I know this is not something I normally make on this channel, and frankly, it's not something I'm ever going to make again. This just took way too much time. But without further ado, I just hope that you guys really enjoy this and get a lot out of it.
All right, starting with resolution, let's go through all the resolution options so you're familiar with them. The Hero 9 introduced a 5K mode at 5120 by 2880. To fit it into a 4K video like this is, I just scale it down 75%. 4K is 3840 by 2160. 4K 4x3 mode is 4000 by 3000 pixels, so it's even taller than this 16 by 9 video you're watching. I'm scaling it down here so you can see the full image. 2.7K is 2704 by 1520. 2.7K 4x3 mode is 2704 by 2028. 1440, which is a 4x3 mode, comes in at 1920 by 1440. And then 1080 is 1920 by 1080. Here's an example of the difference in clarity of some of the major resolutions. On the newer cameras, like this is the Hero 8 for example, the 4K and 2.7K actually look quite similar to each other. It's the 1080 where you can really tell it's lower resolution. I upload every single one of my videos in 4K resolution, even if it wasn't all filmed in 4K. And one of the benefits of that is that YouTube gives you a higher bitrate to stream it at, so it's just better quality, even if you're not technically seeing all the resolution that there is. So any 2.7K footage will just scale up 142.5% to match 4K, 1080 footage scales 200%, or 720 footage scales 300% to match. So obviously you just want to pick the highest quality, which is the highest resolution that supports the frame rate you want. Speaking of frame rate, let's talk about the different frame rate options we have. I would generally recommend filming at the frame rate you want to publish your videos at, but that means you need to know what frame rate you actually like. 24 frames per second is the standard frame rate for dramatic productions like Hollywood movies. I'm a big fan of this frame rate when it comes to the narrative and dramatic story-driven productions. 30 frames per second I think is a lot more common for a lot of TV programs, and I assume a lot of YouTube content is 30 frames per second. 60 frames per second is pretty standard for video games and really good for interactive content, and I would argue is really good for live content as well. I'm using 30 frames per second for all my POV mountain bike videos here. Sometimes I may shoot in 60 frames per second or higher if I want to get some slow motion shots. Since I'm not making dramatic story productions with these videos, and my videos have a lot of action in them with lots of motion, I tend to think that 24 frames per second is not quite the right fit for my GoPro videos. And I know some of you say that you'd like to watch 60 frame per second videos, and some people do that. And then there's actually a lot of mountain bike YouTubers that are using 24 frames per second for all their videos. I'm kind of choosing the happy medium with 30 frames per second. But it's entirely up to you guys. Just know that different frame rates do have a different look to them, and so you can use that to your advantage. I do find that filming some third-person stuff like this can be pretty cool looking in 24 frames. I've only really done that a few times in all my years. I think there's definitely a place for all the frame rates. It just depends on what kind of mood and atmosphere you're wanting to create. Also, the higher frame rates, like say if you're getting into 120 frames or 240 frames a second, the quality is going to drop because the bitrate is the same. And so you have the same amount of bits and bytes spread out throughout so many more images per second. One thing that I've actually found when I would film with 60 frames a second as I was trying this out, I feel like it actually looks like I'm moving slower. I don't know if you guys really find that or if it really makes that much difference anyway, but that's just one thing I kind of thought. An important thing you need to know is that your frame rate affects your minimum shutter speed, which affects how much motion blur there is. When you're in a dark enough setting, such as a forest with lots of shade, especially on an overcast day, usually the camera will end up slowing the shutter speed all the way down to bring in the most light. Now, I have found out recently that by raising the max ISO, then the camera will know to take advantage of that and keep the shutter speed faster to avoid that motion blur. So that is one remedy you can do here. I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but I'm gonna have to go more in detail on all of this in the shutter speed and ISO segments. I do just want to show you one interesting little clip here where I was filming at 30 frames per second so that I could get the 4K resolution super view mode, but I manually changed the shutter speed to a 60th of a second and limited the ISO to 400. And I was very happy with this look while in the trees, that is. But the downside to these settings is once you get out back into the open, with that manual shutter speed being stuck at a 60th of a second, it can't raise back up again to darken the image once you're out in the bright areas. The alternate options I could do in this case is I could just film at 60 frames per second to get that minimum shutter speed and keep it auto to work in different lighting conditions. Or another thing I could have done is just set a higher max ISO like I had mentioned there, say to 1600 or 3200, which also tells the camera to keep a faster shutter speed while bringing up that ISO. At least that's the case with the newer GoPros. I'm not so sure if it did that with the Hero 6, which is what this clip is shot from. But again, I will go into more information on this in the section on shutter speed. I should just mention that when you want to film in slow motion and you know what frame rate you're going to publish the video at, try to stick with double or quadruple the frame rate so that it's easy to change the speed and easily fit in all the frames into your timeline. But you can make 60 frames fit into 24 frames at 40% and 120 frames fits into 24 at 20% playback speed. This gets into field of view. The three main options are super view, wide, and linear, and then with the Hero 9 there's a linear plus horizon leveling mode, and then there's also a narrow mode, which is just a zoomed in linear mode. Wide mode is probably the most used field of view, but super view is also a really popular one, especially in mountain bike videos because of how much you can see in the frame, and that is what I use for all my POV footage nowadays. Now, linear is really cool because it eliminates the warping that goes on the camera, but it does also punch in a little bit on the image. I accidentally used this setting recently while mountain biking, and you can see it doesn't really work too well. You just can't see enough. So this works a lot better if you're using it to film other people. You even have a zoom option, and with the Hero 9 you can even do that on all the resolutions. But this is only a digital zoom, and I don't like it because you can just recreate it by punching in post. So for example, if this is the 2.7K wide mode right here, and then if you zoom in all the way, it goes up about 142%. Well, guess what happens if you were to just record 4K wide mode? You get the whole entire image around it. And so of course you can just digitally zoom in on the 4K image, and it will have exactly the same amount of detail. Or if you take the 1080 option, you zoom in all the way, it's equivalent to a 200% zoom. Again, you just record it in 4K, and guess what? You get the entire image. So in my mind, there's no reason to use the zoom option here. You can just punch in post. I just want to describe to you how the super view mode works. You see, it uses the full surface of the 4:3 ratio sensor, and then it squishes it down into a 16:9 format. You can see with these clips, whether you're recording 4:3 or super view mode, you see the exact same amount on the tops and bottoms and on the sides because they're both using the full sensor. But super view mode does not merely squish the 4:3 image. There are some more advanced techniques going on so that you don't get such ovalizing of the circles. So it does keep some of the proportions intact, which is good. And another cool thing about this is super view allows you to see a little bit more on the sides in addition to seeing a lot more on the tops and bottoms. So that means the wide mode does not actually use the full width of the sensor. The HYPERSMOOTH on these GoPros is really good, and it has been really good since the 7, and it's only gotten better. The options we got are off, on, high, and boost. But if you record super view mode like me, then you can only do off, on, and boost. I only ever use the on mode myself. I never want to use boost mode just because it crops in too much in my opinion, and also I don't really care for over stabilization. So that's just my opinion, and you can do whatever you want. So let's not forget, this is electronic stabilization, which is different from optical stabilization, like a gimbal for example. Electronic stabilization digitally zooms in on the image a bit, so you lose a bit of resolution that way. Also, the shutter speed becomes more relevant now while using HYPERSMOOTH because of how it's digital stabilization. It digitally zooms in on the image and moves the image around in order to compensate for the real life movement that the camera was doing. Which means if there's a slow shutter speed with motion blur, and now you're trying to compensate with that with digital camera movement, you're going to create some really weird and gross looking streaks and blurs across the image that's going to be really weird on our eyes. But the good news is that only ever happens in low light scenarios. I'm mostly talking about low light when the sun is setting or already set. Maybe it's also cloudy and you're in a forest and there's just not much light anymore. That's when you need to worry about it. So if you look at this footage right here, it's getting just on the verge of having too slow of a shutter speed in combination with HYPERSMOOTH, where you can just start to see some of those effects of those blurry streaks of the motion blur combined with the digital stabilization. Do you see what I mean? I was also filming with a pretty low max ISO, which I'll address in a minute. But first, I just want to mention that one of the smart things GoPro has done with some of their firmware updates is they make it so that in those lower light settings where the shutter speed would be too slow, they actually reduce the effects of HYPERSMOOTH. And that's so that you don't get this crazy weird look that a lot of people were complaining about, especially at first when the Hero 7 came out. I think most of you guys know what I'm talking about here. So if you look at this footage, you can see it's actually not that stable, even though HYPERSMOOTH is on. And there's motion blur and it's, yeah, kind of shaky. Now all of a sudden here, there's more light shining in. Do you notice all of a sudden the camera is more stable all of a sudden? There's less motion blur. Everything just looks really nice. And then we get back a bit more in the shade and it starts to look worse again. There's a bit more blur from the shutter speed, plus the camera's not even stabilizing much anyway. But in my opinion, I think that is the right choice that GoPro made. It's a good compromise. Because just imagine all that motion blur, left, right, up, down, still there in the image just as much, but yet with the camera being totally stabilized and everything looking smooth. Well, you're gonna get all these random blurry streaks in and out. But this leads to a very important thing that I just learned last year actually. You see, I was filming this at a max ISO of 400. All I had to do was raise that max ISO to 800, maybe even 1600, and the shutter speed would also get raised up, therefore making less motion blur, therefore making the stabilization become activated again. The only drawback is that with the higher ISOs you get a bit more grain in the image, but that's generally going to be better than a lot of motion blur. I really wish I knew this earlier, and I'm not sure when they implemented this in the cameras. So before I knew this, I was experimenting here and there with manually setting the shutter speeds so that the motion blur would be minimized. So let's say I would film at 1/120th of a second shutter speed in dark scenarios, which would really make it dark, and yet I would still kind of limit the ISO a bunch because I don't want too grainy of images, but you know, then this footage is just garbage, it's just so dark anyway. But I would experiment with that kind of stuff, and you know, sometimes I got okay results. But now I know I could have just set the max ISO to something like 1600, maybe even 3200, and have automatic shutter speed, which is great when you're going in and out of the trees, in the open, in the shade. You want that automatic exposure. And they've programmed these cameras to be smarter now, where they don't want to give you too blurry of an image, which is good because I totally agree. I don't want too much motion blur in my image. And yes, I actually would rather have some green in the image than motion blur. And there's a certain limit to that. There's a happy medium that I really like, which is why it's great that we can just choose max ISO, say 800, 400, 1600. I'd actually like to see more options than that, but this is a really important thing for you guys to know because I wish I knew this earlier. And I just finally discovered this recently. But I have found that even in the past couple years where I was using max 400 ISO with my chin mount set up using HYPERSMOOTH, I was getting away with it pretty well mostly, as long as it was bright midday conditions like the footage on the right. But I actually have been filming a lot more recently with higher ISO limits like 1600 and 3200. And then as a result, I'm kind of annoyed with how much grain I can see in these images. But on the plus side, the stabilization is basically flawless. So there's kind of a give and take, and it's good to be aware of how this works so you can make your own decisions. But another thing you could do is lower the EV comp, like to -1.5, -2. That'll help to darken the image by raising the shutter speed, which of course means less motion blur, which means better stabilization. So of course I'll go more in depth into the EV comp a bit later on. But yeah, you know, there's a lot of different things you can do to affect the way your GoPro footage looks. So now we get into the Pro Tune options. Up until the Hero 8, you always had to manually choose Pro Tune on in order to access all these extra features. But now with the 8 and 9, you can just access these features right away. You can keep all these features on their default settings, which is the exact same look as if Pro Tune was turned off, like say on the Hero 6 or 7. Or you can change just one of the settings, like maybe you want a medium sharpness rather than high. Or maybe you want some more dynamic range by using a combination of the EV comp and flat mode. Maybe you want to use your own custom white balance. This all gets into the fun stuff with this camera, so let's get into it. So the first Pro Tune option here is bitrate, and this is a really simple one. Obviously high is going to produce better quality footage, and the file sizes will be bigger, so you'll be able to fit less onto your SD card. I'm very happy that GoPro finally introduced this 100 megabit per second option on the Hero 8 because I really like to get the highest quality footage out of my cameras. When I pause and look into the field, looking at the blades of grass, you can definitely tell the 100 megabit per second footage definitely has more detail. So obviously I highly recommend using the high bitrate. The shutter speed option allows you to manually set a shutter speed. I've used it more for testing, honestly. I usually just keep this on auto, but I want to use this segment to explain how shutter speed actually works and affects the look of your footage. Cameras have 3 ways of exposing your shot. There's f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO sensitivity. GoPro's f-stop, I believe, is fixed at f2.8. So that means you can only change the shutter speed and ISO to change your exposures. So shutter speed is a bit more important to think about while you're using hypersmooth modes, because the motion blur can become very apparent if the shutter speed is too slow while using hypersmooth. If you're outdoors and in the open, there is so much light that the shutter speed is really fast, which means your hypersmooth will be flawless. Since I make mountain bike content, yes, a lot of it is outdoors, but a lot of it is actually in the shade. And there's quite a bit less light in the shade than in sunlight. The shutter speed needs to slow down to let more light in. Another thing your GoPro can do is raise the ISO sensitivity to also change the exposure. And so with a fast shutter speed, every frame is crisp, super clear. A slow shutter speed has a lot of blur and motion blur. A high ISO means more grain, a low ISO means less grain and a much cleaner image. Now, while things are on auto on your camera, at what point does the ISO start to raise up so that the shutter speed doesn't have to go too slow? Well, I'm not really sure, and it does seem to be related to how high you set your max ISO, as I mentioned earlier. So I've tested out hypersmooth mode, filming at a manual shutter speed of 1/120th of a second, and I find it's not quite a fast enough shutter speed. If I had to guess what the optimal minimum shutter speed would be for a good hypersmooth, maybe I'd guess 150th of a second or 180th of a second shutter. Even though it would be nice to have more of those manual shutter options, they're still not all that practical for most of the time. So for POV footage, I really like auto. For comparison, if you're not using hypersmooth mode, and say if you're using a gimbal, I'm actually quite happy with shutter speeds at around 1/60th of a second or an 80th of a second. Those slower shutter speeds also mean you don't have to raise the ISO too much anymore to compensate, which means you can actually get cleaner images. That's just sort of the nature of using hypersmooth. You rely on faster shutter speeds, which also means you rely on higher ISOs. I've definitely done a lot of playing around in the past, really trying to find out how I can get the best looking footage possible in certain conditions. So take a look at some of this footage where it's a fully manual exposure, locked shutter speed at 120th, no hypersmooth is on here, and also max ISO is locked at 100.
So it's going to be too bright out in the open, and then it should be just right in the trees.
But you can't really use these settings much, they're just way too specific, so you just kind of gotta keep things on auto for the most part. Now keep in mind that if you do choose one of those manual shutter speed options, then the only way the camera can adjust its exposure is with the ISO. That's really not that much room for adjustments, especially if you set the limit down to 400 or 800. But I also just wanted to give you an idea of like, what do these shutter speeds actually look like outside in the bright sunlight? You can see that you need fast shutter speeds to properly look good. So as I said before, when you're out in the open, you have nothing to worry about. Your shutter speed is really fast, around a 500th or maybe even a 1,000th of a second a lot of times. Even a 2,000th of a second, I would guess, also depending on what your EV comp is and that kind of stuff. And I just wanted to remind you again, just what I talked about earlier about how your frame rate affects your minimum shutter speed. So just keep that in mind. If you're filming something at 120 frames a second, then the slowest your shutter speed can go is 120th of a second. Typically that's not really a problem or anything, but just keep that in mind. It's good to know. Now, if I'm filming third person with my GoPro, that's where I really like to have those manual exposures and those fixed shutter speeds here. And this footage is all at a manual 240th of a second shutter speed. And I'm very happy with how it looks. Now let's get into exposure compensation, and this is a really useful tool, and I'm actually going to combine this segment with the color profile segment right afterwards, just because both of these options work really well together when you know what you're doing. So I'm going to show a whole bunch of different test footage to really show how you can increase your HYPERSMOOTH performance and dynamic range as well using both of these options. So the EV comp, which means exposure variable compensation, is just a tool to tell the camera to expose this much darker or this much brighter than it normally would expose. And then of course, the way that it changes its exposure is by using the ISO sensitivity or the shutter speed. So we can use this to our advantage. But one thing I find with these cameras is they generally like to expose a bit brighter than you'd normally want to expose. Testing shutter speeds. So as you can see, when you tell the camera to expose darker, it's definitely raising the shutter speed. So I'm never using the positive EV comps, I'm always in the negative, like -1, -1.5, or -2. Now on to color profile. We have the options GoPro color or flat mode. I will always use flat mode. It just gives you more dynamic range, and dynamic range is a really good thing. More detail in the highlights and in the shadows. Flat mode also has less saturation. Now, when it comes to the increase in dynamic range while using flat mode, it really is more prevalent in the shadows and not so much in the highlights. I noticed this back on the Hero 4 and 5 when I did my first tutorial video years ago, that it pretty much didn't affect the highlights at all and it only brightened the shadows. Well, for these newer cameras, I think it does bring down the highlights a bit, but just not that much. Definitely the shadows are the most affected by flat mode. I even did tests with full manual exposure so that there wouldn't be any kind of automatic adjustments trying to adjust for anything. And you can see the waveform, the shadows are really brightening up. And there is a little bit of highlights being recovered. The exposure should not be able to change at all. Should not be able to adjust. Which is, how does it affect the dynamic range? Highlights here in the sky. So that means flat mode overall is a brighter image, and that's the reason why you really want to use EV comp to bring it down a bit to get the right exposure. Basically, I'm always using at least -1 EV comp with flat mode. If we're really getting technical, some images you can use a -0.5 and that'll perfectly match the GoPro color exposure. Sometimes you want to use -1 and that'll be great. But to be honest, I use -1.5 and -2 quite a bit actually in my footage. So when I do film with flat mode, I do want to increase the contrast again with the curves tool in Adobe Premiere, just to help make things pop again and make sure that my exposures are looking good. So you can see some comparisons here with the GoPro color footage versus my graded flat mode footage. And it's not exactly the same. I mean, I definitely want to keep more dynamic range from the flat mode. And in my opinion, it's definitely better than filming GoPro color. But yes, it does take some work. I understand that some of you don't want to or don't know how to do any kind of post-processing, and I can understand maybe GoPro color is all that you're going to want to do. But let me show you some raw Hero 9 footage here, flat mode, -1.5 EV comp, and I'm very happy with how this looks, other than the fact that it's not actually that flat looking. Granted, these are fairly high contrasty conditions. I'm just saying, maybe some of you might be perfectly happy with how this looks already. But this is how it looks when I would grade it. I'm only really brightening the highlights and the midtones a little bit, not even that much. I have found the 9 crushes the blacks a little bit more than I'd like, and I find the Hero 7 and 8 actually better for dynamic range than the 9 was. So imagine if this Hero 9 footage was filmed GoPro color. I do not think it would look very good. It would just be way too contrasty. I would love to see an improvement in dynamic range for the new Hero 10 and also better audio, but that's a whole nother issue that I'm not even talking about in this video. Now let's actually take a look at how this translates into our riding POV footage here. The 0 exposure compensation with flat mode. Definitely this footage is bright. I do not like this. I never record this, obviously, as I said. -1 exposure compensation is a lot more typical with how I would film, but honestly, in these settings, the sun's going down, I'm all in the shade. I would definitely film at a -1.5 or -2. So here's -2. Now, by the way, the max ISO setting is at 1600. I'm actually noticing some of that grain of the ISO there, and it's also getting darker out anyways. But you know what? The HYPERSMOOTH is working well. There's not too much motion blur. -2 is noticeably a bit on the darker side, especially when you're out in the sun, out in the open. You can definitely tell it's a bit darker. But again, that's where I use my post-processing in Adobe Premiere. I use curves mostly to adjust the exposure and contrast to what I want. I find -2 can work pretty well in darker forests like this with a lot of sunspots so that the sunspots don't get overexposed. But the darks are already fairly dark, so that when I adjust my exposure and contrast with the curves, I really just brighten the midtones and highlights. But that's just with regards to exposure. What about how does your stabilization look? How does the motion blur look? Well, here's some good comparison shots I got here. 2 Hero 8s on my chin camera. The one on the left is just the default factory settings that you get out of the box. And the one on the right is all my settings. They are both the same 1600 max ISO, but 0 exposure compensation is no good. So -1 here, we're going to start to see an increase in dynamic range finally. The exposures look about the same, and we're going to see the HYPERSMOOTH is going to perform better, and there's less motion blur, because the way that the camera is exposing darker is by raising the shutter speed.
Yo!
You can see the stabilization really is working better in the footage on the right.
Oh, that's sick! Okay, why is my bike feeling like better than ever?
So I'm curious if -1.5 exposes even better. And remember, we're speeding up the shutter speed even more in order to expose down. We're starting to see a bit more grain in the image to the right. So this really got me thinking, and I have a theory about what's going on here. See, you have no reason to raise the ISO when you're darkening the exposure by raising the shutter speed. And yet, here we can see more grain, so what's going on? Well, my theory is that they're really ramping up that shutter speed a lot more than they need to, and then they're having to compensate back again by raising the ISO a bit. They certainly don't have to do that, but I think what's going on here is they're just making this exposure compensation setting into something that will reliably increase your shutter speed a lot to make sure your HYPERSMOOTH is working better, so that it's a lot more than just about getting the right exposure. Considering how dark it is, -2 EV comp is actually quite good, and that'll hopefully keep the ISO from going too high. I'm not sure if it affects the shutter speed so much anymore at this point, but I think we can agree I didn't need to raise that max ISO any higher. Honestly, if we did, the camera would probably want to take advantage of that and go even more grainy. Pretty much any time that I'm filming totally in the shade, especially when the sun is going down, I'm always using -2 EV comp. When it's actually darker in real life, then it makes sense to film darker as well. And as we know, that ensures that the shutter speed doesn't go too slow and ensures that the ISO doesn't have to go too high. This is with a max 3200 ISO, and I'm pretty happy with that. I actually found that I'm using -1.5, probably the most. But you are going to have to experiment yourself and really figure out what works best for you.
Oh, yes. Nice.
So let's talk about white balance. I believe white balance is a pretty important option since it really does affect the colors of your image. By default, of course, it's set to auto. This is an example of the Hero 6 on auto white balance not knowing what in the world to do. It just shows you what could potentially go wrong if you do auto white balance. I think the newer cameras have gotten better since, but honestly, I never use auto white balance, so I actually couldn't really tell you. So let's look at all the options we've got here. Starting with 2300 degrees Kelvin. This requires a very warm light to white balance to. We've got 2800, we've got 3200 degrees. Now this is more typical for a tungsten indoor light bulb. Next up we've got 4000 degrees, 4500, 5000 degrees Kelvin. Now this is basically the daylight white balance. At least according to the white balance card I have here, 5000 degrees is pretty much white balance perfectly for sunlight. As we get up higher into a 5500 and a 6000 degree Kelvin white balance, that requires a bluer light, such as when you're in the shade while the sun is setting, maybe the sun's behind the mountains. And now we get into native white balance, which you must color correct this one. So this is definitely a more advanced mode, and I've been using this consistently since the Hero 4. And with my color grade, this is what it looks like. Now compare that to what the auto white balance produces. I mean, it looks pretty much the same. You might notice a few differences there. Now, one of the reasons I've been believing in the native white balance over anything else is because when I would do these tests with the older cameras, like say the Hero 6, I would notice a quality difference in the white balances. So particularly, look at these vibrant greens. It's really broken apart in the auto mode, not so much in the 5500K, and it looks the smoothest in native mode. But thankfully that has been getting a lot better with the newer cameras, like the Hero 8 here for example. The quality looks basically the same. It's more just a matter of how good you are at color grading. And the cool thing about native white balance, you just have a lot more control over the colors since you start with a much more desaturated image. I always love getting the most quality out of these cameras and having the most control over my image, so that's why I liked using the native white balance. The problem is it can be really hard to color correct, and I want to show you why. Just a couple years ago, when I finally bought these color checkers to then test the cameras, I noticed just what kind of image the native white balance produces. So take a look at these screenshots with the Hero 7, 8, and 9. There are 6 main colors that line up with the 6 colors on this vector scope, and then the skin tones are supposed to line up with that upper left line. The 6 colors are red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. As you can see, it's the red, magenta, and blue that need the most adjusting. Now it's true those images were not white balanced, but even when you do, it doesn't change the fact that the reds are very orange, the magentas are quite red, and then the blues are closer to cyan. It does look like the yellows, greens, and cyans are doing pretty well. So this explains why I was never really happy with how my Hero 4 and 5 footage looked when I was using native white balance. I would just add saturation and then adjust the white balance till it looked good, but certain colors were always off, and now I know exactly why. It was such a relief to finally figure out how I could get my footage looking better again, and I'm glad I can share this with you because you probably didn't know this either. So when it comes to color correcting this footage, Adobe Premiere Pro does give you the option to adjust specific hues in its curves tab. And while I do use Adobe Premiere as my editor, I actually use something else for color correction, and it's called 3D LUT Creator. This is, in my opinion, the most powerful color grading program in the world. You can make your own LUTs. This screenshot is an example of what I do to my Hero 9 native white balance footage while using the AB grid. And you can do way more things in this program, and it is wildly powerful, does way more than I could ever want to do in it. And I have no affiliation with them, I'm just saying. Go look them up if you want an extremely powerful LUT creator program. I just want to give some examples of what this footage would look like without my custom made LUT, with the same saturation and white balancing and everything, just showing you how certain colors like those reds are way off. And when you fix these specific hues, the red on my DaVinci Wilson looks amazing. The blues are better, the purples are better, even the greens are better. Basically everything just looks more true to life. So the process I go through with my native white balance footage, you first want to white balance it. After that, I add my LUT, which involves correcting all of the hues as well as adding saturation. And then I add curves using the RGB curves in Premiere. And I also add some sharpness as well. I do film on low sharpness. I'll talk a bit more at the end of this video. I also found out recently what the actual color temperature is of native white balance. While taking some raw photos on my GoPro with native white balance, opening up in Lightroom, it says here it's 7,150 degrees Kelvin. And this makes a lot of sense because a couple of years ago what I would find is that when I film in a bluer kind of light setting, such as when the sun's setting, it's behind the mountains, I'm in the shade, it was actually already white balanced. All I had to do was apply my LUT, apply my curves, and it looked great without any white balancing on my part. And I've seen that consistently with footage filmed when the sun is going down. When it's behind the mountains, you know, it's already white balanced. So all I have to do is add the LUT and then add contrast. But that's definitely not the case when it's the middle of the day. That's when I have to manually change the white balancing, and I do that in Premiere Pro. Usually I can kind of figure out the white balancing and then just kind of apply it to all the clips of that day's footage. And so the white balancing does slightly change depending how high the sun is in the sky, or is there clouds there, is there light cloud cover, heavy cloud cover, am I in the shade or not? So there is still some adjusting I have to do from day to day. And I'm not always happy with my results. Sometimes it can get a little bit frustrating, especially with the Hero 9. This is something I found out. The Hero 9 in native white balance has more of a greenish cast to it. Specifically, there's just less blue. And I have no idea what's going on there. I'm not sure if that's just my specific camera, or I wonder if you guys have that problem too. But yeah, I just found the Hero 9 was just a little bit more greenish looking, and I don't really like that. Though that is mostly just prevalent in native white balance. If you're using auto or a manually set white balance, that doesn't really seem to be the case as much. So that just makes it more difficult for me to adjust my white balance with the Hero 9 native white balance footage. So because of that, on the Hero 9, I have been opting for the manually set white balances. Mostly the 5000 degrees Kelvin does look like the best bet, and experimenting sometimes with 5500 or 4500 to see what works when. And then I do still need to adjust the white balancing just a little bit, but not too much, depending on how much cloud cover or how low the sun is, or am I in the shade or in the sun. And like I said, I just do some minimal editing on the white balancing, maybe make it a bit warmer or a bit cooler, and I've been happy with the results. But I just really wanted to make sure you guys were aware of how difficult it is to color grade that native white balance. It can be pretty frustrating. So now we got the ISO minimum and ISO max, or limit settings. You've heard me talk about ISO quite a bit already throughout this tutorial, so now let's just make sure we understand how all of these settings work. The ISO minimum you're always going to want to set at 100, because that means that it can go as low as 100, which gives you the cleanest image. The ISO limit is just the setting that tells the camera what you're allowing it to go up to. Now of course, the higher the ISO, the grainier the image, and also the brighter the image. How's the motion blur? Yeah, the shutter speed is slow. Now remember, setting the limit does not actually mean that that's what the ISO is, because it's still on automatic. So setting the limit to 6400 doesn't mean that it's actually going that high. In my garage here, the 800 and 400 ISO looked more closer to what it looked like in real life to my eyes. You can tell that the image is getting cleaner, less grainy, and also exposing darker. Personally, I don't really find there to be any use in setting a 6400 max ISO limit. It's just so grainy, it just destroys the footage. Now, if you do want to manually set your ISO, that's where you need to set both the minimum and the limit to the same number. So here you can see the exact kind of grain that these ISO settings produce with the same kind of exposure. Because of course the shutter speed is automatic, so it's keeping the exposures exactly the same. And now let's see what happens when you change the max ISO to 6400 so that it's fully automatic. Honestly, I think it's exactly the same as 100 ISO. The shutter speed is still really fast, so the ISO can afford to be as low and clean as possible. Now, do you remember earlier I was talking about how if you have a higher ISO limit, you can allow a faster shutter speed, which helps out with your HYPERSMOOTH performance. So what I've typically been doing is setting a max ISO of 1600 or 3200 at times. I used to be doing a max ISO of 400, and you can see in this clip how that's just not a smart thing to do. There's too much motion blur. So even though I no longer film in 400 max ISO, I definitely used to, and I could get away with it quite well, but that's because I was not using HYPERSMOOTH. This is the Hero 6 on a gimbal, and as I mentioned before, that means you can afford slower shutter speeds, which also means you can afford a lower ISO, so you just get cleaner images. You get some nice motion blur, but it's not too much or anything. And yeah, that's just the reality of using an optical kind of stabilization versus digital stabilization, which is HYPERSMOOTH. So you remember those comparison clips I was showing you when I was talking about flat mode and exposure compensation? So even with the same ISO, the -2 exposure compensation really helped out that shutter speed. But then what if I switched it to 400 max ISO? Comparing it, you can see, yes, it's a cleaner image, less grain, which is nice, but also more motion blur because that shutter speed has to go slower. What do you think? Do you think that's any good, or maybe not? And then comparing again to that default setting, the 400 max ISO actually was looking a bit better. It just shows you what you can do with these cameras. There's really a lot of room for playing around. But there are times when it's dark enough, I've got to go up to 3200. This is something I really want to see GoPro improving on, is their low light performance. so that when you get into those higher ISOs, it can keep a cleaner image. So we'll see what the next iteration of GoPro can bring to us. And just so you know, it doesn't matter if HYPERSMOOTH was on or off, that max ISO still affects your shutter speed the same. So now let's get into sharpness. The default mode is high sharpness, so if you have an older camera and the Pro Tune is turned off, it's just always going to be set to high sharpness. And I think it looks pretty gross and fake looking. But you've got three options: high, medium, and low. I'm always shooting everything in low sharpness, and then I actually add some sharpness in post. But if you're not someone like me who likes to do all sorts of post-processing, maybe just film at medium sharpness. I think that'll be a great bet. So I just add sharpness here in Adobe Premiere Pro. I just use this sharpness slider in the color grading section. I put it up to 50 for the Hero 8 and 9. So you can see after I raise the sharpness a bit, it doesn't even quite look as sharp as the medium mode, but I do think it looks quite good. It just kind of has a more elegant, natural look to it, I find, and just not plasticky and fake. There's a secret spot meter option on these cameras where you just hold your finger down on the middle of the screen and then pops up an option for spot meter, so you can say yes or no. The purpose of this is to force the camera to only really look at the middle portion of the frame in order to judge exposure. By default, it kind of looks overall at the entire image to expose, and there are definitely times when this does help. Like say if the sky takes up a part of your image and the camera wants to expose for the sky, but you really want to expose for the ground. Now the door's in the center, that's definitely brighter than otherwise. And now the middle window's in the middle, it's a lot darker. So I think you guys can agree it really makes quite a difference, and I would say this is something you want to use really sparingly. I've been using it a little too much lately and I regret it actually. I was using it on a bunch of clips here at Whistler, and I definitely regret it because it just made the footage want to go too dark too often. So you can see some of these sunspots shining through the trees. Now the camera wants to expose for the sun, which makes it really dark. Plus I was filming at a -1.5 exposure comp, which already makes it a bit dark, and the spot meter does not help. So if I had the spot meter off, it just would have kept a more general exposure constantly, which would have been nicer on the eyes. So basically it's good to just be aware of it, and personally I probably won't ever use this anymore, but hey, there are times when I might use it, maybe you want to use it, whatever, go crazy. Alright, and that will be it for this video. I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys learned a ton because it just took so long to really make this video and put it all together. I've been wanting to make this video ever since the Hero 6 came out and just been putting it off. Well, now I finally committed to it, and so I hope you really got something out of it. I hope that you guys can understand how your GoPros work a lot better now, and it'll help you to get even better footage. Also, for those who don't know, I have actually been recovering from an elbow injury, so that's another reason why I haven't really been uploading, and it's basically the reason why I thought I really should commit to finishing this video now, since I haven't really been riding and not been able to film other videos. Also, just so you know, I don't think I'm ever going to make a video like this ever again, so don't subscribe to me for any more GoPro tutorial videos. This kind of stuff is just kind of a one and done thing. I made it once before on the Hero 4 and 5. This is the last one I'm doing. It's just way too much work, and frankly, I just would rather make mountain biking videos. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to support my work, check out my Patreon page. My patrons are amazing sponsors of my channel, and they keep me rolling. And you can get great perks like extended cuts, early videos, free stickers, all that kind of stuff. Thanks guys, and see you next time.
Sick.